Hi, it's Warren Hewitt here. Hope you're doing marvellously well today. As ever, please subscribe and go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list where you'll get loads of free stuff. There's drum samples to download, there's access to our Vimeo account, and all kinds of fun things. And of course, there's always the competitions we do, and you'll be able to enter to win different EQs and compressors and microphones and all kinds of fun stuff. Okay, so today in lesson 9, we're going to talk about EQs. That's equalizers or equalization. Now, there are many different types of EQs. The main ones that you're going to come across in the hardware world are going to be parametric EQs, semi-parametric EQs, passive EQs, active EQs, and of course, high and low pass filters. Now, that sounds like a lot of different things. Well, let's go through them step by step, and we'll show you what they do. And I'll show you the hardware ones, and I will also show you plugin equivalents, so that when you're using your plugins, you'll get an idea of what the originals look like and how they work, and then how you can mimic them using plugins. Okay, so let's get started. So what I've got here is a pair of heavy guitars. So let's just take one of the heavy guitars and listen for a second. That's a Gibson The Pull, going for a Pro Junior with a big muff pedal on it. Let's turn on an EQ here that I'm using. Now this is a Filter Bank Mac DSP EQ. Bypass it for a second, everything perfectly flat. Let's listen. Now I can unbypass it, and I can just turn off all these, and we can engage them slowly. Okay, so the first thing I've done is I'm using the high pass filter. That's what this HPF stands for. That is the most basic form of EQ, would be high and low pass filter. Now, a high pass filter means the high frequencies pass through. High pass filter. A low pass filter means the low frequencies pass through. And in real terms, what that means is, let's engage it. You see here, if you look to the left where the low frequencies are situated, they are being cut off. So if I go up like this, you'll see that I'm cutting more and more low frequencies and allowing high frequencies to pass through, hence high pass filter. What I've done on this is just go down to 70, which is kind of out of the way of the kick drum, because most of my kicks happening about 60 hertz or so, and I'm just cut it. So I'm cutting any kind of low rumble, which is the first thing I would do on many instruments that don't require the low lows. I would just use a high pass filter and cut the low lows out. Now my guess is, unless you're listening on like a huge PA, you're probably not going to hear that much of a difference. On a pair of headphones or earbuds, you're not going to hear this. It's pretty subtle. But trust me, that kind of subtlety means a lot when you're talking about a lot of instruments, lots of guitars, lots of instruments with like keys and stuff that have maybe some low rumble. If you go in there and clean up the low lows and just leave it for the kick drum and the bass guitar and maybe a bass synth, your mix will get a lot cleaner and a lot louder. It will be louder because low frequencies take up a huge amount of energy. For instance, if you went to a show and they had a 10,000 watt PA, so say a 10,000 watt PA, about 300 to 400 hertz and below, which is like low mids and low end, is probably going to use around about 6,000 watts. So about 60% of the volume that you're hearing is coming out of the low end. So one way to get your mixes really loud, so they sound loud and aggressive, is just to clean up. I mean, you can get really hyped and go up here, but go up very high. But just in general, if you use a high pass filter when you engage your EQ, you're going to create a lot of volume and a lot of clarity in your mix, because lows get very muddy down there. Okay. So that's the first thing I've done. Use my high pass filter on this guitar to cut at 70. The second thing I did was boost some low mids. Put it in. Out. Back in. It just gives it some real guttural guts. I love it. And usually around about 350-ish is where I cut a lot out of the drums. I'm sure you've seen me talk about that in many videos. So what that's going to do is like give us some girth, but it's not going to get muddy because I've cut a lot of that out of the drums. That kind of 200 to 300 to 400 area is a little bit scooped out. I do like 100, 110 on the bottom of a snare, and we're probably catching a little bit of that with the guitars, but that's fine. The snares are very short. You know, it's not a continuous sound that's going to muddy up. The next thing I'm boosting here is just the top end at 5K. Out. Back in. I like that little zzz, that little 5K. That to me gives me like the fuzz. Like it sounds like a fuzz pedal. So I'm exaggerating what I like about the big muff distortion pedal with this guitar. It's very easy with a big guitar sound like this to hear the boosts and cuts. So now what you can do, and this is getting a little bit more in depth, what you can do here is you can control, you know, your EQ quite consistently. And you can see, like, you see this little thing here, this little diagram, that's the dip and the peak. And that basically what that is doing, if you see me adjust it like this, see what it's doing here if I take the peak down? Take the peak up. What I do like about plugins in general is they give you a visual representation so you can understand what you're doing, which is really, really important. The slope here, you see what that's doing? It's basically taking the EQ and it's making the EQ kind of narrow or wider like this. So it literally is the slope like this. So if our boost point is 5K here, if we narrow our slope like this, and then we widen it like that, see how much softer it's getting? And it's basically doing this. So it's catching a lot. Now, that's not quite the same as a parametric EQ specifically. We can look at that later, but it's doing a very similar thing where it's basically widening and softening the reach. So you've got 5K in the peak here, and then it's softening how much it pulls up around. So if you've got that slope very wide like this, you're not just pulling up 5K, you're pulling up a lot of stuff around it. See what it's doing there? And that's nice. If you want a generic kind of top end boost, then do that. You know, do a little widen your slope, because sometimes you don't have to be surgical. You might just want to brighten your guitar sound or brighten something up. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, this very, very detailed thing. Sometimes you just want a generic boost. Okay, cool. So that's a basic, one of my favorite plugins. It sounds really analog to me. It's modeled on analog EQs. It's not a surgical EQ. You're not going to get in there and pull out frequencies, but it's a very generic kind of way of doing really, really good sounding EQ. Okay. Let's try a different plug-in EQ. So we'll just turn that off. I do that by hitting Control Command on my keyboard here and then clicking on it. Okay, so let's go and find another EQ. The Q series here. Let's do a Q3. This is a parametric EQ. Now we can do some similar things, but let's have a little bit more fun with this. Now this engages the EQ here. The fixed points are 30, 62, 125. That's just where it defaults to. So let's just say I want to boost, I don't know, 110. I can just select 110 by clicking on it there. And let's do this. So that's my gain. You hear it's adding a lot of low 110 there. Now my Q control, and this is what makes it a parametric, is I can widen or I can narrow the Q. Have a look physically what it's doing. Let's boost it really high like that so you can see it. Select back at 110. So, and then let's watch this Q here. See, look at this? Look how much that's narrowing it. So it's really, that's what parametric EQs were initially designed for. They were very popular in PAs because if you got some feedback, you could go there and you could find the specific feedback frequency, then narrow the Q so you were just getting that frequency and then tuck it out. I find personally parametric EQs more personally useful for cutting frequencies rather than boosting it. Because if you finesse and get a very, very tight cue, you can pull that out with you barely noticing that it's gone. So here's a boost. Let's go somewhere really obvious. Listen to that. I can really hear that 660. Now let's do the opposite. Let's pull it out. Bypass. Back in. Now it's slightly different. It's slightly different, but considering that there's 18 dB of cut, but with a Q set to 100 on here, it's really not that big of a deal. So what if that was a horrific, horrible frequency, which it kind of is. I mean, it's kind of an offensive frequency. I mean, it's... That's pretty horrible. 795. We can pull that out. You see, in and out. It's in. Bypass EQ. I mean, there's a difference there. And it's subtle, but there is a difference there. But the point is like, if that was a really horrific frequency that I wanted to get rid of, you can see how much you can pull it out. And with the Q set that fine, you could really get rid of an annoying frequency. So parametric EQs are fantastic for getting rid of things. I mean, obviously they're nice if you want to boost something specific. I find that if I'm doing a bunch of guitars together, like let's have a look. So let's put this guitar on here, and then let's put another guitar that goes over it here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this Q down here, and let's double it up so there's one on each. I'm going to pull this Q down here and have a listen. Just kind of, it's adding kind of a metallic, the 801 there. So what I'll do is I'll press Option, click on it, drag it over the top of here, and now I'll do the reverse. I'll cut that. So what I've done is I've taken 800 and boosted it heavily, very heavily, using the Q function, made it very narrow, and cut it from one guitar and added it to the other. Bypass them both. There's a bit of separation, it's nice, but let's listen now. So what's effectively done there, and obviously these are very, very exaggerated, but what I've done there is I've boosted and cut the same frequencies. So I've taken a very, very narrow amount out of the heavy guitars, and that same narrow amount I've boosted in the other guitar. Now obviously this is very exaggerated, and I probably would never do quite as much boost and cut like that, but you can see how that can help create a little space. Because you've got layers of tons of guitars, you can sort of start just carving little pieces out just to fit them into each other. You can get very surgical. It's tough. If you get extremely surgical, your mix can sound a little lifeless and too put together. So don't be afraid to be a little wrong and have things struggle a little bit with each other. But it shows you very effectively how a parametric EQ can work. Okay, great. So those are like two of the two main types of EQs that I can use here in Pro Tools. Obviously three if you count a high pass and low pass filter, because of course we could do the same thing if we got like let's go to a more, you see here, On this one here, we have a low pass filter as well. So I can engage that, put it on 12 dB per octave, which basically just is the most aggressive one. And I can come down and maybe come down to like, I don't know, 10 here, 10K. Let's have a listen. Let's boost more. So I'm really brightening my guitars, and then I'm bringing my low pass in. It's nice around there. So what I've got is around about 8K here, and I've got a 5K boost. Now you might ask, why would I want to do that? Well, the thing with using a low pass filter is like now 8K and above is gone on those guitars. They still sound loud, they still sound crunchy, they still sound aggressive, but I've now got all of that room now for my vocal to have some air on it. I've got some room there for my cymbals to breathe. And I don't have to boost the cymbals over the top. I'm cutting high end and low end out of the guitar sound. It still sounds big, still sounds, you know, rock, but it doesn't have this extra superfluous high end and super low end that is going to get in the way of the cymbals and the vocals and the bass guitar and the kick. So there's your low pass filter as well as your high pass filter. Okay, great. Let's look at some hardware EQs. Okay, so this is a passive EQ. So let's just, the bulb's blown, but it is working. So let's just turn everything off for a second. Let's select 100 for our super lows. So engage the EQ. Here's a boost on 100. Pretty drastic. Now the way the attenuation works, now you might say attenuation, that's actually turning it down. Well, the way it works in a passive EQ with a Pultec like this is it focuses the 100. So at the moment the 100's quite wide. It's like a very wide slope. So I bring the attenuation on. Off, on, it's just focusing that 100 better. That's really nice. Probably a lot. Blow your speakers up. I would probably do something a little bit more like this. Off, low mids. I'd probably do this and use the high pass filter as a plug-in and combine the two together. Now let's go for some 5K like we were boosting on the plug-in and boost that. Here, see the bandwidth, I can make it pretty broad. Again, so it's like sharp and broad, it's this, you know, sharp, broad boost. That's nice. And there's all our top end, our aggression on the guitars at the top there. And again, we can attenuate it and focus it a little bit more. Probably something like this will sound fantastic. So that's a passive EQ. Out. In. It's pretty awesome. I mean, that's exaggerated. I wouldn't ever go quite that crazy. But so when you're using your plugin, you can see what that really does. So let's go back to the plugin and hear one of those. Okay, so let's look at a plug-in version of it. Of a passive. Let's go to EQ. There's the Puig Tech ones, I believe, which are a simulation of what we were just looking at. Now, it's important to understand the way that active and passive EQs work. A passive EQ was, first of all, these EQs, these passive EQs came out long before active EQs came out. I still think like the original passive EQs are kind of the holy grail of EQs. They're very expensive, very well made. They use tubes, etc. That's the thing about those Pultecs, those Pulse Techniques EQs. They're wonderful, but obviously they didn't have the finesse of active EQs. And we'll look at some more active EQs on the console and other places in a second. But the reason why a lot of engineers, mixers, producers, etc., the reason why we love passive EQs, the way they sound, is because they affect the whole signal. Now, hopefully this makes some sense, but imagine you've got the signal traveling from A to B. It comes into the unit and comes out of the unit at the other end. A passive EQ takes the whole signal and applies EQ to it, and then it comes out the other side. Now you might say, isn't that how they all work? No, it's not how an active EQ works. An active EQ sidechains it. It takes a piece of the signal and boosts part of it and then folds it back in. Now the purists will say the problem with that is it shifts the phaser line. Now again, that might be well above where you're at the moment, understanding phase and stuff like that. And to be honest, it doesn't matter if you do or don't. But traditionally, the reason why engineers, producers, mixers love the passive EQs is because of the way they don't seem to affect the sound in quite the same way. They affect it in a musical way, but they don't seem to sort of... You ever heard that phrase, it sounds too EQ'd? I think that's when people get really aggressive on EQs and it just kind of starts to sound unnatural. Passive EQs aren't that aggressive, can't really do that, but when you do use them, they don't seem to sound as much EQ'd. Sorry, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so here is a simulation of what we just used. So we got the 100. Here's the attenuation. I mean, you'd have to go back and compare. I'd be intrigued. Put some headphones on and compare the two. I don't think that sounds as lovely and low and as rounded as a real one. However, it does sound good. I mean, they're great EQs, but it would be interesting for you to give me like your opinion when you're listening to the video in those two places. So let's do the same thing. We'll go to 5K. Boost here. I feel like I'm having to give it a little bit extra boost to sound the same as the other one. Set the attenuator. It's good. It sounds really good. And now, as to whether it's exactly the same as what we've just used, I'll let you be the judge of that. We can make it a little broader on the EQ. It's definitely adding a lot more level, and there is a gain control. This is a nice feature that they've added, which isn't on the originals. So I could adjust. That's the only problem, is the gain. Here we go. Pretty comparable gain. Close enough. There's a bit more of a boost. But you see, I brought it down by a little over, maybe 3.5 dB or something like that by the looks of it. So what that's done is that's a feature only on the plugin, which isn't on the real ones. What it's done is it's allowed me to boost the EQ, which will make it perceptibly louder, of course, and then I've cut that gain, additional gain that's done that, so I can sort of check between the two. So that is a plug-in simulator of a Pulse Techniques passive EQ. It's great. Does it sound exactly the same? I don't know. You tell me. You got to hear both of them together there. Okay, so now we're coming back into the rhythm guitar channels on the SSL here. EQ is out, so we'll engage it and we'll see what it's doing. So there's no plugins on. There's no passive EQ on. So let's just engage here. Now what I've done, to go up to the top here, I've used my high pass filter and my low pass filter. See, I'm cutting around about 8K. So it's only letting 8K and below come through. And this is cutting at about 70. And it's only letting 70 and above. So I've now narrowed my guitars between 70 and 8K. So again, same thing, it's allowing some room for the vocal and the cymbals. And on the other side, it's getting rid of enough low-end rumble to let the bass and the kick come through. Because that's the first thing I've done. Second thing I've done is I'm going to about 200 here, and I'm doing about a 4 or 5 dB boost at 200. Take it off. Put it back on. Hear that? Off. On. Now I'm doing a little cut. So here's 800, a little tiny cut. Now this is a parametric EQ. It's an active EQ, but it's a parametric. And it's doing, that's the width of the cue there. So it's doing it relatively tight. To the left-hand side is a tight EQ. To the right-hand side is a wider EQ. And then I'm cutting probably about 2 dB at about 800. Off. Hear that nasaliness? It's back off. Okay, now I'm doing a little, actually I'm not doing anything there. Just cut a little bit on that 2.5. Do a tiny bit of cut at around 2K. Now at 5K on these guitars, I'm boosting a lot. Before, a little cloudy sounding. After, look at that. Okay, so everything engaged now, it's bypass. It's a good guitar sound, but now it's a better guitar sound. So what I'm doing with the EQ on the console is I'm doing all the same tricks that I was doing in there. I'm cutting 70 Hertz and below away. I'm cutting 8K and above out of it. So I'm left with a guitar this wide rather than this wide. I'm then boosting the lows at about 200 and I'm boosting about 5K and above. I'm also cutting a little bit of low, well, mid-range at 800 and a little bit at 2K. Just a tiny, tiny amount. That's giving me room for other things to breathe. I like the 800 on the bass sometimes to give me that kind of nasally, so that nosy sound, that kind of dong precision tone. And I'm cutting a little bit of 2-ish because there's some parts of the snare and there's definitely the kick pedal hitting at 2.5 that I pull out a little bit just to allow that comfort. But anyway, this is not necessarily just about guitars, but it's showing you what I'm doing with a sound. Before, after. Before, after. Great. Okay, so let's just briefly touch on one other thing. We've done the basics of all the different EQs that are available as far as types, but look, there are so many different EQs. If I go to EQ3 one band here, this comes with Pro Tools. There's different versions of it, and you can see it can do everything we're talking about. So, I don't know, let's go to the, what's the one they have? Here's a 7-band EQ. So this is the free 7-band one. It does everything that we were just talking about. So we can sit there, we can go, okay, we can select 70 here. So let's just put in 70 Hertz here. Let's engage it by pressing in here. Let's increase the slope to 12 dB an octave, which basically just means it's more aggressive. So there's our 70 cut. Now let's go to our next low pass filter here. Sorry, go to our low pass filter here, let's engage it. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 8,000. Okay. Let's make that more aggressive. So now we've done the same kind of slopes. Okay, let us go to our low frequency. Let's select 220 and do a nice low boost. Bypass. In. Nice. That sounds great. Okay, let's go to 5K here. Let's boost it there. Bypass. Good guitar sound, little mid-rangey. Great guitar sound, nice and aggressive and horrible, in a good way. So, you know, that's just using the one plugin. That does everything we want to do. It's got a high-pass filter in it. It's got a low-pass filter in it. They're parametric, so I could widen and narrow those. For instance, look at the top. See what it's doing? That's your cue control. So it's adjusting the slope and the dip. It can be surgical if you want it to be. Get to its narrowest, widest there, narrowest there. So that you don't have to buy all the expensive simulation EQs. With the basic ones that come with Pro Tools or whatever your DAW is, you can get creative. I do find that I like the analog simulated ones just because they maybe aren't surgical, but they have a sound to them which I find pleasing. Having said that, if you gave me just those plugins, those EQ plugins, I would mix the same way. Maybe I wouldn't be as aggressive using some of the ones, but I can tell you, you can mix and make great sounding music using those plugins that come with the DAW. And I work with a lot of very, very well-known mixers that use a lot of just those plugins that come with it. Not everything is esoteric and expensive. You know, those are good sounding plugins. For instance, the Avid reverb that comes with it, the plate in that is a really, really good plate. And myself and many other mixers use that plate sound because they really like it, and it comes free with Pro Tools. So don't be under the delusion that you have to necessarily buy some of the more esoteric ones. I will say for me, the filter bank ones, I just like the way they sound. They're not as surgical. I like the Waves ones and those kind of plugins because you can get very surgical with the Q, but the EQs that come with the DAW, with this particular one, Pro Tools, can do most of that stuff as well. And it won't stop you from making great music. Anyway, thanks ever so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please, as ever, subscribe. Go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list. And you'll get free access to the Vimeo stuff, you know, behind the scenes at Sunset Sounds, some drum recording tips, some piano recording. And of course, there's always competitions running and you can win great prizes. And thank you ever so much for watching.